We're talking today with Orland Mittelberg of Richmond, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born April 16th, 1927, in a little community called Cook, Nebraska. About 350 people, farming community, and I lived a mile north of Cook, Nebraska.
Okay.
And I lived there till I was 7 years old. And because of the dirty 30s, my father owned his little 80-acre farm with hogs at 5 cents a pound and wheat at 3 cents a bushel. He was not able to make it. Okay. And we moved to Lincoln, Nebraska.
And what did your father do there?
He became a decorator, painter, and paper hanger, trained by my grandfather, who was that also.
Okay. So it kind of goes into family business at that point.
It happened to be on my mother's side, right. Though. The Mittelberg family had farming interests in the Cook area. And by the way, the population is about the same today as it was then, because it's big corn country.
Right. Okay. Now, let's see, you're born in 27, so you're still pretty young when Pearl Harbor happens, but do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, we were listening to the radio and all of a sudden we heard that bombs were falling in Hawaii, and we were glued to the day, December 7th most of the day on the radio. Okay. And that was the main, that was before TV. And,
okay. Now at that point, did you figure that the war would be over before you were old enough to get into it, or did you not even think about that?
I think we just followed. It was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the war was going on already in Europe.
Right.
And it was not happy times, sad times.
Yeah. Now, how did the war affect the community very much? Were things different during the war, whether rationing or other stuff?
Yes, we had tire rationing and gasoline rationing, and we had gasoline stamps, as I recall. And in fact, my father went into a munitions factory in Nebraska. I think it was Arlington, Nebraska. In fact, during that time he helped to make bombs, and he got some TNT poisoning and really got into some very big health problems because of that.
All right. And now for you, did you finish high school?
Yes.
Okay, and when did you graduate from high school?
Graduated in 1945.
Okay. Now at this point there still is a war going on, and there was an active draft going on. So as you're approaching the age of 18, how do you handle that?
Well, I decided I didn't want to go to the infantry, and I thought I wanted to go in the Navy, and that's what I did. Okay.
Now why the Navy?
Oh, it just seemed to have more romance to me than mud and dirt.
Okay. So how did you go about enlisting?
Got permission from my folks, and as I recall, my mother went with me, and I signed up.
Okay, and when did you initially sign up?
St. Patrick's Day, 1945.
All right. Now at that point, do they give you a delay so you can finish school, or what do they do?
I had already graduated. I graduated December of 1945 from Lincoln High.
Or 44? Because
44.
Yeah. Okay.
Got it.
Keep track of the math there.
Yeah.
All right.
It was 44.
Right. Okay. And so, what were you doing after you graduated?
I had been a paper carrier for the Lincoln Journal, represented the Lincoln Star. I was making $75 a month going to high school, and joined the Navy and only got $50. It was a real letdown. I thought, I'm not too good a businessman.
Okay. So when do you actually report for training then?
I reported in May.
Okay.
of 1945.
All right. And where do you do your boot camp?
Great Lakes training.
Okay. Okay. So Illinois. And what was that training like?
It was interesting. I enjoyed it. I like everything organized. Sometimes it was a little too organized. There was a lot of discipline. It was a very learning experience, and I enjoyed it.
Okay. Aside from discipline, what were they teaching you, or what were you doing?
Endurance, getting in shape, making your bed, and inspections, and order. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember we had a guy from Arkansas that didn't like bathing, and there was caused some fragrances that we wanted, and I remember they all got him tied up, and he had his first shower, which was a different experience. I wasn't a participant, but I was a spectator.
All right. Now, how long did you spend at Great Lakes?
As I recall, I went home on leave in July, and I was an outgoing unit about the time of VJ Day.
Okay.
And as I recall, I was in an outgoing unit, and Mittelberg, along with 17 other people, went to Millington, Tennessee, and Morelli went to Occupation Japan.
Okay. So they just worked their way down the list of the graduates and the first X number of guys go here. Okay. So what was at Millington, Tennessee?
Millington, Tennessee was a fighter pilot training area.
Okay.
And I just got into the dining room the first day, and an ensign came in and said, "We're looking for a volunteer person that can type." And I was told you never volunteer for that because it's usually KP duty. And I just happened to mention to the guy, I said, "I can type, but I don't know where that would go." And later somebody went to the ensign and said, "There is a guy that can type if you're really serious about a typist." And so he called me in and said, "How come you didn't interview? How come you didn't volunteer?" And I explained it, and he said, "Well, it sounds like that could happen." He said, "Sit down there and go to work. I need you to work in the office."
Mm-hmm.
And that was a great decision because it was in the galley, and so I became a commissary, a storekeeper, and I moved along pretty fast.
So what does the job consist of?
Primarily typing menus for the chief. We had a chief petty officer cook, and I worked along with an ensign and another real cute little wave that was an ensign, and it was pretty good duty. And I had keys to the refrigerator and steaks that I could cook on the grill. Had a key to the refrigerators. I learned to drive a 5-ton steak truck. Went to the technical training center across the road. It was Millington, Tennessee was a big Navy area. There's a hospital, technical training, and we had a lot of planes flying in and out. It was exciting duty. And we were, I think, something like 20 miles or 25 from Memphis, Tennessee.
Okay. So what's a typical day like on the job then?
Oh, about like working in an office. It was, once in a while I'd have guard duty at night on the main gate with a gun. And in fact, living that close to, I actually had a private quarters, so I didn't have to sleep in
The barracks.
a barracks. It was good duty. In fact, I was really kind of considering maybe a lifetime, but then the ensign was replaced by a chief petty officer that became a big influence in my life. I think the Navy helped me to redirect my life into what I am today.
Okay. Now, let's see, did you get to go off the base much? Okay, where would you go?
Memphis.
Okay. Now, you're in the segregated South. Did you notice that particularly? I mean, coming out of Nebraska, I guess Cook, Nebraska, I suppose, would have been mostly white. Did you notice any of that, or did not really pay attention?
Oh, it was, Beale Street was off limits. You could not go to Beale Street. And I spent time going to different meetings and got involved with the Youth for Christ. And I really kind of got defined, especially as this chief petty officer was a fine Christian gentleman that actually got me to think more than just religion, but he was very biblical based. And as I decided to go to college, he had contacts at Wheaton College, and he really started mentoring me. He took me under his wing, took me there, and as it worked out, he lived in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, which was only about 200 miles from Memphis, and we used to go weekends there. And as it worked out, as I applied for Wheaton College, as I knew that I was going to go to college, I got, they only accept about 10% of their applicants because of space. And I was not refused or rejected. I was refused because of space. And they said if you get to a good accredited college, we can almost guarantee you can come as a transfer.
Right.
So it so happened that Ouachita College at Arkadelphia, Arkansas, where he lived, was a accredited college, and I went there my first year, and then transferred to Wheaton College, which
All right.
and that's where I met my wife, and so it defined a lot of things.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit here about sort of the service history part. So you go in May of '45, you have a couple of months of training at Great Lakes, and then you go down to Tennessee. I guess August, was around the time of VJ Day.
VJ Day happened while we were there,
right?
Arrived.
Right, okay. And then how long do you actually stay in at Millington then?
I was there until I got discharged.
Okay, and when was that?
August of 1947.
Okay. Now, did you have the option of getting out earlier than that?
Well, we were sold on the fact you join and you can get out on a 2-week notice.
Okay.
And so my job in the Navy was just like an office job. I didn't, I didn't have to do drills and that type of thing. I was pretty much, it was just like working in an office.
Okay. Now, were you in the service long enough to qualify for GI benefits? Or?
Yeah, I had 4-year college.
Okay. All right. Okay. And then, so you get out, so once you do get out then, because you go 47, now did you remain in the reserves in some capacity at that point?
Till my enlistment was up.
Okay.
I never did, to my knowledge, I never did get, it was just up and done. I never did get another certificate.
Okay. So you were basically in the inactive reserve when you got us 47, so you're not having to go to meetings or doing any of that stuff.
With the option that they could call you up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's as I understood it.
And when the Korean War started, did you get worried that they might call you up?
I got nervous. I was in college. But they didn't really use many Navy people. Korean was more infantry.
Yeah. All right. Now, what did you study in college?
I studied business.
Okay.
Business administration.
All right. And then what did you do once you got out?
Wheaton College had very deep roots in Service Master Incorporated, and I was hired by what was called Wade Wenger and Associates, which became service master. And the man that was my boss became the CEO of the whole company.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where I met my wife, and I actually worked for service master for a year and a half, and was in their sales training, and would have been, I would have been an officer, I'm sure, in the company if I'd have stayed.
Mm-hmm.
But we got married and lived in Oak Park for 6 months. I had Oak Park, Forest Park, Berwyn, Cicero, and the Austin area of Chicago, and was on my way. But a lot of the executives were in Downers Grove. They spent 3 hours a day commuting,
Mm-hmm.
and being an old country boy, I was not real fancy with that. And I married a girl from West Virginia, and I think my father-in-law knew that I was not real happy with that. And he said, "Why don't you, at Christmas time, resign and come down to West Virginia?" And that's what I did. And people at Service Master weren't too happy.
Okay. So what did you do in West Virginia?
I went to West Virginia, and we went at Christmas time in 1952 or three,
Mm-hmm.
three maybe, yeah, three. And my wife was a registered nurse, so I thought, well, that'll work out well. And so we got down there. We'd been married about 6 months, and all of a sudden we find out she's pregnant, which kind of changed
Mm-hmm.
things. And being an old Fuller Brush man in college, I started to go around and meet with the business people, telling them that, and my father-in-law was in a furniture store right
Mm-hmm.
next, right on Main Street, and was pretty well known.
Mm-hmm.
So I had several independent job offers, but I wanted to go with a larger chain.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to get hired with Penny's and had interviews, but they said, "This is January and we don't do much hiring.
Mm-hmm.
Come back and see us in the spring."
Yeah.
So I walked across the street to Montgomery Ward's, and they were looking for a paint manager, and my father being a decorator
Mhm.
and so forth, I got hired to manage the paint department. So I walked across the street and talked to Hen Sheets and said, "I'm coming back. I'm going with the second best retailer in my mind instead of the first, and I want to offer my services to you, give you a chance to hire me before I go with Montgomery Ward's." And he
Mhm.
said, "You're serious?" I said, "Absolutely." And I said, "So I'm here to give you a chance to hire me." He said, "Well, what are they going to hire you for over there?" And I told him. He said, "Come back and see me in the morning." He let me talk to my assistant. So I go back, and he said, "Will you do anything, work in the stock room or clean floors, scrub floors?" So they had a pretty big store.
Mhm.
I think they had something like 40 or 50 employees. And I said, "When do I start?" And he said, "Monday morning."
Mm-hmm.
So, and Mr. Penny was a fine, had a pretty good reputation, had the Golden Rule stores. So it was considered a Christian layman. In fact, he has Penny Farms down, and he has a retired minister's thing down in Florida. And so that kind of the faith thing in Mr. Penny.
Mm-hmm.
And that also decided other things. I'm a Rotarian, just been honored for 50 years.
Mhm.
Mr. Penny was a Rotarian. My three managers before that, two managers were Rotarians, and they rode ahead. I worked in 5 different stores. I was in our second, in our 6th largest store in Omaha, Nebraska. And then they sent me to Minot Ware. That was Minot, North Dakota.
Mhm.
Not the end of the world, but you
Yeah.
can see it from there.
Right.
But if you know a little about retailing, there were 652,000 people in the state, but my trade area was 165,000.
Mhm.
So it was a great, and I managed the store there for 20 years.
Okay.
In fact, Penny's were wanting to send me back to Chicago to open a treasury store at Oak Lawn. And I said, I'm with the Penny Company because I left Chicago.
Mhm.
So that kind of defined, now we're here because living in this institution, my wife is in assisted living.
Mhm.
And I'm near her family. So,
Okay. All right. Now, I want to go back to the time that you spent in the Navy. If you think about that period there in Tennessee, are there kind of individual things that happened there or impressions you had of the place that kind of stand out in your memory? When you think back to that, what do you think about?
I think of the great influence that a man by the name of Chief Petty Officer Bill Abrahams had on my life,
Mhm.
and the really getting Christian principles in my life. That I was thinking at one time of going into the ministry. In fact, I did study a little bit of. I was in Greek and anthropology for a few weeks, and it still was Greek to me. And anthropology was a pretty dead subject, and I took some vocational interest testing, and was told that you hit the business end way high, mathematical and so forth. So I changed my major.
Right.
And, so it, as I said, I think the Navy for me helped to define who I was and what I wanted to do, and I think I'm still maintaining that pattern. One of the mottos of Rotary is service above self, and I'm pretty big on volunteering and still am doing that. I do it right here in this particular unit and do it in other areas in our community. And, service above self is a big thing in my life. So I think the service helped to define through good contacts. Mentoring is a very, very big thing in people's lives, and I like to mentor myself.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming in and sharing the story today.
Okay.